The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Tits Out Brigade. It's me, Anne. I wanted to let you know about a fundraiser that I'm doing all this month, the month of April 2023. Trans rights are under attack seemingly everywhere, particularly in the United States. That's been in the news lately, but it's an issue all over the place. And I, as a person, and this podcast as an entity, we stand with all trans people everywhere. And so to raise some money, I'm running this fundraiser all month called Tits Out for Trans Rights. So you can get all the details if you go to vulgarhistory.com/donate. That's vulgarhistory.com/donate. It's two-pronged, the fundraiser. So first of all, I'm raising money for the Trevor Project, which is an American organization that supports LGBTQ plus people. And then also I've got a new item in the merch store, which is an item featuring trans icon, the Chevalier Dayon, who I talked about in an episode last season with guest host Maya Dean. And all the proceeds from sales of the Chevalier Dayon merchandise this month is going to be donated to Point of Pride, which is another American organization that helps support trans people. If there's another organization that you're planning to support this month anyway, somewhere close to home, something that is meaningful to you that supports trans people, there's a form also on my website where you can just list what the donation was and who you gave the money to. So at the end of the month, I can give a grand total of how much the Tits Out Brigade was able to raise as part of this fundraiser. Also, for everybody who wants to, I will give you a shout out to all the people who donate in a later episode of Vulgar History. So again, you can get all the details of this fundraiser at vulgarhistory.com/donate. Tits Out for Trans Rights. Hello, welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a special episode I'm talking with author Max Wallace about a book that when I first saw it listed, I was just like, what? When I saw the name of the title and the subtitle, and then I looked into it and I was just like, oh, first of all, I need to read this book. And second of all, I hope I can talk to this author on the podcast. And both came true. So he's written a biography of Helen Keller. It's called After the Miracle, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller. And it is such a fascinating read. I thought I knew the deal with Helen Keller, and we talk about this a bit in the interview that you're about to hear. And so I just want to go over sort of the widely known saga of Helen Keller, which is that she was a little girl in Alabama. When she was 19 months old, she contracted an illness that ended up making her deaf blind. So she couldn't see, she couldn't hear. And then sort of the narrative is that she was just this kind of feral child and nobody could get through to her until a woman named Annie Sullivan came to teach her. And then the really big aha moment, famously recounted in Helen Keller's own autobiography, and then later in the play and the movie, The Miracle Worker. There's a moment when Helen Keller was 6 years old. And so Annie Sullivan had been spelling out letters in her hand, and it just didn't seem like Helen was really connecting the letters being spelled out with the objects that she was being shown. There's a moment where Annie Sullivan held one of Helen Keller's hands under water from a water pump and spelled out water on Helen Keller's palm. And then this was the moment where it just seemed like Helen Keller would, like that clicked for her, like, oh, this means this means this. And so a lot of the story of Helen Keller has been interpreted as sort of like Annie Sullivan, like it's called The Miracle Worker. It's Annie Sullivan as the miracle worker. Like it was a miracle that she taught Helen how to read and write and communicate. And as this book explains, Helen herself, I don't know, with a different teacher, similar or different things might have happened, but the person that Helen Keller was, like, thank goodness that we're able to know what she was like, because it turns out, as much as she is still remembered today as this kind of saintly advocate for the blind and for the deaf, she was, in fact, a radical activist and advocate for her whole life. And anyway, so Max Wallace is here with me to talk about the legacy of Helen Keller and how he's revisited it in this book. So I hope you enjoy this chat between me and Max Wallace. Okay, welcome, Max Wallace.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you about your new book, After the Miracle, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller. So as a first question, can I ask you, before you were working on this book, what was your understanding of Helen Keller?
Well, like most people, I read the story of my life. I think I was forced to read the story of my life in grade school. And so, again, like most people, my image of Helen Keller was this 6-year-old deaf blind girl at the water pump in Alabama. And, that's all they ever told us about Helen Keller. And then, imagine my surprise years later, I'm an historian, and I was doing a book about Nazi Germany, about the Third Reich, Charles Lindbergh's Nazi affiliations, and I come across Helen Keller, raising her voice against Hitler, against the rise of Nazism. And then I did another Holocaust book a few years later, and I find that Hitler is burning her books and banning other books and censoring other books. And they never told us about that side of Helen Keller, that's for sure. So I was very, very intrigued.
And was that where your decision to make this book came from, to sort of figuring out like what on earth was what's she doing in this Holocaust story?
Yeah, exactly. And then I started looking into her, and I was captivated by this incredible figure that very few people know this other side of her. This all happened. Her legacy was forged when she was 6 years old, but she lived till 88. She lived till 1968, and nobody ever talks about her incredible adult life. And the other part was kind of boring. And there's a term for it now, inspiration porn. Disability advocates call it this uplifting story that's designed to make non-disabled people feel uplifted and inspired. And that never really interested me. My aunt was blind, so I did know that the obstacles that people with disabilities go through to some extent, right? Just seeing the obstacles that my aunt faced. But I was never really inspired by that story of Helen Keller at the water pump. And, but when I discovered this side of her, I was very inspired.
Honestly, when I came across your book, just in a list of, upcoming books, even just the title, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller, and I thought, the what now? Because I had the exact same understanding. She was kind of a deafblind girl who learned how to communicate, and I just never knew or thought to look into what did she do after that. And so it was incredible, everything you have in here. So can people should read the book to get the whole story, but some highlights of what she did after age 6.
Well, part of the original story that I guess people also knew was that she was the first deafblind person to graduate from university. She goes to Radcliffe. She graduates summa cum laude, and that was an impressive accomplishment for somebody with multiple disabilities. Radcliffe didn't exactly go out of their way to accommodate her. She had to fight every single step of the way. But this is all part of a large part of the Helen Keller myth is the story of Annie Sullivan, her teacher. And, that I think probably more people now know the story from watching The Miracle Worker, the 1962 movie with Anne Bancroft. And The Miracle Worker really casts Annie Sullivan as the hero, and Helen Keller becomes a secondary character in her own story. So it's all part of that the savior narrative, right? About the miraculous person who rescues the marginalized person, and we're supposed to celebrate this, and I guess people did for decades. But once again, it completely sweeps Helen Keller's incredible life under the rug.
Well, and you mentioned in the book just something I hadn't considered, but the movie version of The Miracle Worker, so the actress playing Annie Sullivan was nominated for Best Lead Actress. And then
Right.
the actress playing Helen Keller was supporting actress, which really clearly it was just seeing the way that he wrote it in the book. I'm like, oh yeah, that movie is about Annie Sullivan, heroic teacher, and Helen Keller is just kind of there.
And that movie ends when she's 6 years old in Alabama. And so this is the 1880s. So she's born in the postbellum South. Her grandparents were slave owners. They lived on a plantation, and it turns out, this has never been revealed, but her father, Arthur Keller, was the first man in Alabama to take the obligations of the Klan. So in the 1860s. And so this is the upbringing that she had. And later on in 1916, she sends shockwaves through the South by issuing she gives a financial donation to the NAACP, the fledgling NAACP, which had just been formed a couple years earlier. And she sends a letter talking about how she's ashamed in her soul to be from the South because of the tears of the oppressed. This incredible broadside against Jim Crow and anti-Black racism. And needless to say, this was not well received among white people in the South, especially her family. So there's, intense pressure on her to take it back and backtrack. And this is sort of a constant theme throughout her life. Her employer, Annie Sullivan, her parents, or she would take these very radical positions all through her life. And then there will be intense pressure for her to, you're jeopardizing the welfare of the blind community. You're jeopardizing your reputation. There was a very concerted effort to cast her as a secular saint. So even when they did talk about her adult life, it was always supposed to be as a shining symbol of overcoming adversity, resilience, etc. So comes as a shock to all Americans. In 1912, she suddenly announces that she's joined the Socialist Party of America. And not only that, but she's no garden variety moderate socialist who believes in achieving socialism at the ballot box. She starts to talk about revolution. And the only way to transform society is through a full-scale revolution. And part of this, the epiphany, this is what I discovered the famous epiphany with Helen Keller is Annie Sullivan runs her hand under water over her hand under the water pump in Alabama when she's 6. But the real epiphany that I discovered is when Helen Keller discovered that the majority of blindness and disability in America is caused by workplace accidents resulting from a lack of worker safety. So this is an epiphany for her. And she starts to link disability with capitalism. And she travels the country talking about the commercial, the greed of commercial society. And, people are expecting to hear her talking about her inspirational story, and she's indicting capitalism. So, needless to say, this is not well received by the media, by the public. The media starts to, this ableist narrative attaches to her where she must have been manipulated by those around her, though the wonderful blind girl certainly could never have come up with this on her own. So Annie Sullivan gets blamed. And ironically, Annie Sullivan was very conservative. Um, Helen Keller is a staunch feminist. She becomes a militant suffragette. And Annie Sullivan doesn't believe in socialism. She doesn't believe in suffragism. She doesn't think that women are capable of exercising the vote. While Helen Keller's telling the New York Times that she's a militant suffragette for one reason, because suffragism will lead to socialism, and socialism is the ideal cause. But people just can't accept that Helen Keller could have come to these radical ideas by herself. She must have been manipulated by people around her, and this continues throughout her whole life. This ableist narrative about how, well, no, Helen's a saint, so it must be the people around her, the communists, the socialists, Annie Sullivan, are manipulating her. And very typical. She's very outraged in the beginning. She is very feisty, and her rhetoric is revolutionary, and she's outraged by this, and she's very funny too. She has this incredible sense of humor. She's befriended by Mark Twain. Mark Twain loves her sense of humor. A lot of people have discovered that her wit is very biting, and she starts to use her sense of humor to counter this ableist narrative. So she, writes these essays mocking the media for assuming that she's been manipulated by those around her. And she's always smarter than her critics. So I think a lot of this went over their heads. But it's quite fascinating to watch these rhetorical strategies that she uses to counter the ableist narrative that's always greeting her political ideas. And she stops. So at one point, she becomes very conscious of her financial limitations. She needs a job. She goes on the lecture circuit, and she's making quite a lot of money. She goes on the vaudeville circuit for a few years to pay the bills, and eventually she seeks stability. So she gets offered a job by the American Foundation for the Blind, a full-time job, which gives her a semblance of financial stability. She's a fundraiser for the AFB, large national organization working for the welfare of the blind community. But unfortunately, she realizes that she's going to have to tone down the rhetoric, right? She's seeking money. She's going hat in hand to these capitalists that she's been condemning a couple of years earlier. And so she stops that revolutionary rhetoric, but she does not stop believing in socialism. She just sort of tones down her approach. And this is the part of the narrative that's attached to even her political side, is that after 1924, after she goes to work for the American Foundation for the Blind, she becomes apolitical. Her politics have mellowed. Her nephew gives an interview years later saying that her early socialist politics are a historical relic. So it's acknowledged, there's documentaries and biographies that talk about her early socialist ideas. But this all supposedly came to an end in 1924. After that, she becomes mostly liberal in her outlook on society. but I discovered a very different story. I probed FBI files, intelligence dossiers, private archives that actually revealed she moved to the left after 1924. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia inspires her, and she starts to take a very left wing, much further to the left than her old socialist analysis. She starts to almost parrot the Communist Party line for a couple of decades. And this is another side of her that's been swept under the rug. Even those, they've acknowledged that she was once a socialist, can't accept that she was actually a communist.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hello, my name is Alison Larkin, and I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast. This podcast brings Jane Austen's stories to the 21st century, along with commentary from me and conversations with fascinating people who all share a love of Jane Austen. And of course, we had to start with none other than Pride and Prejudice. So join me as we embark on a journey through some of the most wonderful stories I know. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. Well, and you say in your book, there's a part, one of the many interesting things about your book is you sort of interrogate previous biographies of her. And one of those called her socialism a phase or something like that.
Right.
And you're like, a phase that lasted 15 years? Like, that's not...
Right. That, yeah. I mean, her most celebrated biographer is Joseph Lash, who writes the first major biography of Helen Keller in 1980. And he was a socialist before the war. So he's very sympathetic to her early socialist politics. But then, starting in the 30s, it's very clear that she's moved to the left. She makes no secret of her admiration for the Bolshevik Revolution. She calls Vladimir Lenin the greatest living figure repeatedly during her vaudeville tour. And she spends the next 3 decades championing the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's very clear that she has a lot of admiration for communism. She soured on Stalin early on. She realized that he's a tyrant. So she's quite critical of Stalin, but still retains this admiration for Bolshevism. And yet Joseph Lash in 1980, years later, he talks about how she was duped by the communists because she started to embrace the anti-fascist cause during the Spanish Civil War, and travels with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which had been formed by the Communist International, and so she's a very strong opponent of fascism. First, she's denouncing Hitler very early on, before most people knew what was happening in Germany. She's warning Hitler. She sends a letter saying, do not think your barbarities towards the Jews are unknown here." So she's an anti-fascist. She's almost the epitome of Antifa, long before that became a pejorative of the far right. And then the Spanish Civil War happens, and she's very prophetic. She speaks 6 languages, including German. So she's reading periodicals in Germany. She knows a lot more about what's happening in Europe than the average American, because she's reading the news in all these various languages. And she's warning Americans. She's criticizing the New York Times for being too soft on Hitler. So she spends the whole decade, as a crusader against fascism. And yet, according to her major biographer, she's been duped. Again, this ableist narrative that starts in the 1910s is still there in 1980. So, and probably today, I'm sure there are a lot of people that hear about her political crusades and figure, oh well, she must have been manipulated by these people, because the wonderful Helen Keller could never have embraced an ideology that goes against America.
And that's what's so fascinating to me. Like, when I was reading this book, every page I was just like, what? Like, the amount of major civil rights figures that she's interacting with. Like, you open the book with her thoughts about the arrest of Nelson Mandela. Like, it's just, I picture her as this little girl in 1900s, early 1900s. So she lived for most, like, up till 68?
Yeah,
She
died in 1968. Yeah.
Like, she lived through so many major political moments in history, and she had a strong opinion about all of them, and she wrote about it.
Exactly. So it's out there, right? This isn't a secret, and yet most people have no idea, and they certainly have no idea that she continued these political crusades after 1924. So yeah, you mentioned Nelson Mandela. I came across in an archive, and this has never been revealed, that that in 1956, Nelson Mandela and the entire African National Congress are arrested in a pre-dawn raid and put on trial for treason, and they're facing the death penalty. This is a long time before anybody's heard of Nelson Mandela, before apartheid becomes a liberal cause célèbre. And Helen Keller had traveled to South Africa. She spent 2.5 months in South Africa in 1951, just 3 years after apartheid had been implemented. And she was appalled by what she discovered. Now, she's from the South. She's from Alabama. And in Alabama, at that time, the conditions facing African Americans were not that different than the condition facing Black South Africans. I interviewed 2 of Mohandas Gandhi's grandchildren who met her during that tour, and one of his granddaughter, Ella Gandhi, ended up under house arrest years later. She worked for the African National Congress. She was an MP and an ally of Mandela. And I asked her, why do you think Helen Keller was so shaken by apartheid? It wasn't that much different than Alabama at that time. She said she thought the major difference was that in Alabama, a large white majority was oppressing the Black minority, but in South Africa, it was a tiny white minority oppressing a massive Black majority. That would have been the major difference between Alabama and South Africa in 1951. So then then a few years later, the dissidents start to organize against apartheid. Nelson Mandela is arrested, put on trial for treason, and the civil rights activist writes to Helen Keller in 1959, asking her if she'll help raise money for the defense fund. They're running out of money. Mandela and the others are facing the death penalty, and they thought that an appeal from a beloved figure like Helen Keller would might help the cause. Now, this is the height of the Red Scare. Helen had spoken out against McCarthy, publicly spoke out against McCarthy and McCarthyism, and she again faced intense pressure from her employer. Told her this is jeopardizing your reputation, the cause of the blind community, and yet when she gets this letter asking for her to issue an appeal for funds, she doesn't hesitate. She writes this very poignant letter about the poison. We have to stop the poison of racism and oppression. So she issues this letter as well as a financial appeal, and that's never been revealed. It's just one more incredible story from her life that's been ignored or forgotten in favor of a more familiar narrative.
It's so fascinating to me. It's so fascinating to me. Like everything in this book is, you're saying like some of these things were never revealed. Like it was in the best interest of other people to just have her be this kind of heroic person who learned how to read, and that was it.
Right.
But I love that all this stuff is coming out now. But can you talk a bit too about some of her more problematic views? I'm thinking specifically about eugenics.
Yeah. So in 1915, she very briefly, now this is a period where the socialists, so-called progressive figures, have embraced eugenics, the idea of selective breeding, or there was this idea that eugenics would help curb the misery of overpopulation and poverty. This was certainly Helen's rationale. Her friend, her very good friend and socialist comrade, Margaret Sanger, who we now know as the founder of Planned Parenthood and a celebrated figure in feminist history, was a very ardent eugenicist. And so a baby is born in Chicago, the Bollinger baby, with very severe birth defects. And Helen weighs in. She shocks a lot of her admirers by the doctor that treated this baby decided that the baby was better off dying. He was a staunch eugenicist himself, and this sort of furthered his agenda. And Helen weighs in and says, a baby with these severe defects is almost certain to become a criminal. So she parrots this eugenic line, and it's a little bit shocking, considering the compassion that she always showed for the most vulnerable members of society. But this is very short-lived. This is the only real example. And then, 2 decades later, she reverses course. She uses her status as a disability icon to condemn Hitler's eugenic policies. So yeah, it certainly has cast a stain on her reputation among some segments of the disabled community.
Well, and I think what I find really impressive about her is she was a woman who was consistently, like you were saying, she knew several different languages. She was keeping up with news. Like she's someone who I picture every day was just like, what's the latest theory? What's the latest news? What's happening in every country? And she would change her views based on what she was reading and learning. Like she was a lifelong learner.
Right. And unfortunately, she was reading these treatises by fellow socialists and by so-called progressive figures who, for a couple of decades, genuinely believed that eugenics was a progressive idea. Obviously, the whole world was shocked by how eugenics was applied later by the Nazis. But at that time, it was still this progressive concept. I think a lot of people don't realize in the context of that it was the left that was embracing eugenics. Now, one big difference between Helen and a lot of the other people, including her mentor, Alexander Graham Bell, he was a eugenicist. But a lot of these eugenicists were also racist, and they talked about sterilizing immigrants and forced sterilization of racialized minorities. Helen never took up that racial eugenics. It was strictly about babies born with severe birth defects and that sort of thing. So if there's a bright side to her eugenics, to her short-lived embrace of eugenics, it was that she was never a racist. Annie Sullivan was a racist. I mean, that was fairly typical at the time. Annie Sullivan was a New Englander who considered herself very enlightened and pro-Negro and anti-South, and yet her writings are riddled with racism. But Helen had, very early on, seems to have made these connections. Now, intersectionality is this catchphrase in academia, right? And Helen Keller was making these links between race, gender, class, and ability most of her life. Other than that, tarnished phase of eugenics, she was an incredible thinker. So yes, she was reading this stuff, but she also had a very sharp mind. I think that's a lot of people, credit Annie Sullivan, because how else? How did Helen Keller become such an accomplished figure? It must be a credit to her teacher. She was clearly a prodigy. Sort of a once in a lifetime mind.
Well, and I think I forget if it was on the back of your book or if it was one of the reviews. It said Helen Keller, like, she's known for learning how to speak, and then your book is talking about what she did with her voice. And I thought that was a beautiful way to explain kind of what your book is doing.
Right.
And honestly, it's so shocking to me. So now I think to learn all this stuff about Helen Keller that is not so widely known, and you see her on quotes, inspirational quotes, the Helen Keller Barbie doll, and she's still very much seen as this kind of like saintly person who all she ever did was be deafblind.
And apart from her politics, which obviously my book focuses a lot on her political views, but I was really captivated by her as a person. She loved to drink, loved a beer. She loved dirty jokes. Mark Twain. She talked about how Mark Twain. She was drawn to Mark Twain because the profanity it came from his mouth. Right? People talk about their friendship, but they never talk about that side of her. They don't want to be thinking of Helen exchanging dirty jokes with Mark Twain and other people. She was friends with Harpo Marx and Dorothy Parker, and a lot of people associated with wit. They loved her sense of humor, and that she went on vaudeville for a few years, and there was always a question and answer session at the end of each performance. And that was often the highlight. The audience would ask her a question. So somebody would say, "What do you think of capitalism?" She said, "It's outlived its usefulness. What did America get out of the First World War? The American Legion and a bunch of other troubles." The audience roaring with laughter while making these political points. So, I love that side of her, other than the politics.
Yeah. So it's really what I think is really great about your book is it's uncovering the human being, like the person. What's her personality? What were her opinions? What were her thoughts behind this oversized myth? Like I thought I knew who Helen Keller was, but I just kind of knew the mythology of a person who wasn't really a human.
Right. Yeah. So I'm hoping readers will sort of leave with that side of it. There's a lot of great progressive disability advocates today that have sort of taken up that mantle. She's no longer, she's sort of an anachronism among some segments of the disability community. But I love people to be left with that image of this feisty woman who fought the good fight while enjoying a beer and a dirty joke instead of the 6-year-old girl at the water pump.
No, exactly. Do you have any Actually, that's a perfect response. I was going to say, what do you hope people get out of the book? What do you think the connection between... Actually, here's my final question for you. If Helen Keller was around today, what do you think she would be up to?
Oh, I think she would have, all through her life, when there was a conservative politician in power, she loved nothing more than to take them on. She, I could just picture her on the warpath against Trump and his ilk. Uh, a disability advocate criticized her a few years ago and said that Helen Keller is not radical at all. She's just another privileged white woman. History telling the story of a privileged white woman. And Ted Cruz immediately tweeted his outrage at this. How dare you call the great Helen Keller privileged? And, if Helen were around to see herself defended by a politician that stands for everything she opposed in her lifetime, I think one of her favorite epithets was a dung beetle. She called this right-wing columnist a dung beetle, Westbrook Pegler in the 50s. I'm sure I could just picture her calling Ted Cruz a dung beetle for defending her.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's just... You mentioned that in the book too, and it's such a beautiful illustration of the misunderstanding of her entire legacy and what she was about.
Right, where somebody like Ted Cruz, can summon her image to serve his agenda. It's a little bit troubling that people. If Ted Cruz only knew that he was defending a radical socialist.
Oh, exactly. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to press on my listeners. Like, this is such an interesting and fascinating book, and just some of the sources you were mentioning. It's like you're saying you're getting into FBI files and stuff. Like, you really are unearthing some fascinating information that's never been widely known about Helen Keller, and I think that's so important.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
So again, this book is now available wherever you like to get your books from. After the Miracle, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller by Max Wallace. And honestly, I think I said this in the interview, but reading this book was just blowing my mind. She's almost like a Forrest Gump level person. Like, every prominent figure of the 20th century, somehow she either was friends with them if they were cool, or she wrote angry letters to them if they were awful. She was just all up in everything. And it's wild to me that even while she was alive, and her legacy now just doesn't discounts either that this is what she was actually like, discounts that these are actually what she thought. It's such an interesting, good book. I super recommend it. And this is the Vulgar History Podcast. So to keep up with me and with this podcast, I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, and I'm also on TikTok at Vulgar History. And you know what? I was just thinking too that this really ties in with some other conversations that we've been having on this podcast about how when history is taught to people, like the understanding, like for instance, of Helen Keller, it's like, this is what she was like, and this is what her story was like. So any new information that challenges the concept that she is this little girl at the water pump who then grows up to just be this kind of like saintly advocate, it's like, well, no, here's letters and documents and proof that there was more to her than just that. It's met, I think, with some resistance from people who don't want to reinterpret what they had been taught, what they thought Helen Keller's whole story was. So that's where it turns into, as Max was saying, she was manipulated to think these things. Like, oh, it was just a phase. Like, she couldn't possibly have been the person who she clearly was for 80 plus years of life. Anyway, we're getting to such interesting stuff lately on the podcast, and this book ties in so tidily with it. I was really happy to be able to talk with Max. Anyway, what was I saying? Vulgar History. We also have a Patreon if you want to listen to this podcast ad-free and early access to episodes. If you join my Patreon for at least $1 a month, you get the early ad-free access. And for $5 or more a month, you get the bonus episodes as well. My name is Anne Foster. This is Vulgar History Podcast. We'll be back with another episode really soon. There's a lot of episodes coming up this month and next month, because between the stuff I'm doing and all these books that are being published that I want to talk to the authors about, there's going to be, like this week, there's going to be several more weeks with 2 episodes per week. So enjoy. Anyway, until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Morachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.